I'm a senior lecturer at Schumacher College down in Devon, and I have been running a master's program in ecology and spirituality, and for political and complicated reasons that's no longer happening, but I'm working on developing a new master's program in environmental humanities, and because I'm doing it, there will be a healthy dose of psychedelic content within it. So that's coming on stream in 2020. That's the advert over. So, a few months ago, one of my master's students came to me with a brilliant idea for a dissertation. What she wanted to do was write about how psychedelics, and in particular ayahuasca, could help solve the ecological crisis by engendering ecological awareness of exactly the kind we've been hearing about this morning. And I thought this is great because there's loads and loads of anecdotal evidence for people having what's called ecodelic experience, not just psychedelic, but ecodelic experience. And Sam very elegantly summarized some of the scientific research on that today. Lots of people have what Jay was describing, the experience of spirits, the manifestation of spirits, what I call animaphany. It's a Ponzi word, it just means you experience the world as full of people, only some of whom are human. Mushroom spirits, tree spirits, plant spirits, animaphany. And also another Ponzi word, hylozoism. It's a word that's fallen out of favor. Most people talk about panpsychism now. Hylozoism just means that aliveness goes all the way down. It means literally matter and alive, life matter. And yes, we might argue whether plastic is alive, but we could use this other word, autopoiesis, which comes from Maturana and Varela. Autopoietic things are things that maintain themselves. So, hylozoism. Anyway, I've had this experience on my very first mushroom trip when I was 19. I beheld the aliveness of things. I sat there with a conker, the seed of a horse chestnut tree, marveling at the swirls of its grain, like a monk might the raked gravel of a Zen garden. So I thought, this is great, fantastic. Let's do it. There's only one problem. This is a master's dissertation, and academia is a game, and there are rules of the game. And what you can't do with a master's dissertation is write an apology. Where's the critique? Where's the edge? In particular, I was thinking about, where is the answer to Wiliam James? Now, Wiliam James, the great founder of psychology, but also the study of psychology and religion, writing in the early 20th century, is justly famous in psychedelic circles, to the point of cliche. He's always quoted. Michael Pollan quotes him. Shouldn't be rude about David Nutt. David Nutt quoted him yesterday. The same quote. In fact, I'm going to propose a little breaking convention drinking game, or variant of the drinking game. Whenever anyone quotes the quote from Wiliam James from his amazing chapter on mysticism about ordinary waking consciousness being but one of many, and there are others separated by the filmiest of screens, you know the one? That we either take a shot of ayahuasca or a drop of LSD, and we'll see how we're getting on by Sunday. I'm doing pretty well so far. He should be famous for this quote from the same chapter. Mystics, he says, have no right to claim that we ought to accept the deliverance of their peculiar experiences if we are ourselves outsiders and feel no private call thereto. What he's trying to say is, if you, say, have had the experience of self-transforming machine elves, like bejeweled basketballs coming to you, urging you to speak, that's indubitably true for you. But I am under no obligation to believe you. No matter how many of you have had that experience, I am under no obligation to believe you. And if you think I'm being unkind, there are a lot of Scientologists in the world, and just because there's a lot of Scientologists doesn't mean we should all become Scientologists. This is a beautiful challenge to us. It's all very well to say, yes, psychedelics put you in contact with nature, but why the hell should anyone believe us? I don't know what my student is going to say in answer to James's challenge, because she hands her dissertation in on Friday. I'll let you know. But it got me thinking about what's my answer to James. So this talk is really my answer to James. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is do what we do in the study of religion, which is we bracket the truth claims of people's religious experiences. We don't care whether they're true or not, whether they have ontological validity. We just put them in a bracket and we put them to one side. But we still take their stories seriously. The next thing I'm going to do is what anthropologist Frédéric Apfel-Marglin calls reverse anthropology. So I'm not going to be looking so much at ecodelic experiences. I'm turning the academic lens back on our culture and asking why might our culture, what are the conditions that have led our culture to a position where we can't take them seriously? So I'm turning the lens back on us. Well, it's obviously got a lot to do with this guy. No expense spared with the visual aids. Descartes famously made the distinction between what he called res cogitans, mind, and res extensa, matter. Humans are the only things that possess mind. Mind and matter meet in our pineal gland. And he also invented Cartesian mathematics. And these are orthogonal to each other. So, of course, if we have a Descartesian view, the world can't be alive. It's a kind of dead machine. And this led to the Newtonian view of the world as a kind of clockwork machine. Interestingly, one that is stubbornly in place, I would say, in Western culture, despite the advances of 20th century physics. But I'm not going to dwell on philosophy, you'll be glad to hear, because I'm not a philosopher. I'm a scholar of religion. And I'm actually interested in, rather, our idea of the self and why our culturally specific ideas of the self might prevent us from taking seriously ecodelic experience. I was hoping this picture would get a laugh, but I think it says a lot about modern culture. I'm not going to talk about Eastern religions or Eastern worldviews that say there is no such thing as the self. So if you were going to come and collar me in the corridor afterwards and go, hey man, don't you know there's no self? Yes, and I'm not going to talk about it. So allow me to get my cup of tea. I'm going to stick totally to the Western view of the self. Now I think, again, excuse the visual aids, this, I think, is the predominant view of the self in contemporary culture. The individual self, individualism. And the two features of this that are important are, one, that the self has a hard boundary around us. We are bounded, we're like billiard balls. And the second is that there's only one of me in here. There's an I, a singular subject on the inside. That will become important in a minute. And the Australian philosopher Freya Matthews has written very cogently and very persuasively about how Descartesian thinking led and inspired Newton, and that has led to this Newtonian atomistic view of the self. I find it very persuasive. And I think there's been a couple of papers touching on this yesterday, and this is obviously the idea of the self that underpins neoliberal late capitalism. This idea that we're all just bouncing around like billiard balls, making rational choices out of our self-interest, buying the things that, like T-shirts that express our identity, freedom of choice, blah, blah. You know the story. It's not a very ecological view of the self, right? It's like a billiard ball. We're just bouncing around. So there's been attempts philosophically to create an ecological self. Notice the arrows look suspiciously like mushrooms. The idea is that we can expand the boundaries of ourself. So the self is still hard and bounded, there's still me in there, but the things I care about, or the envelope of things that I care about, can be increased. So when I fall in love, my beloved falls into my purview. When I have children, my children fall into my purview. And the idea is that if we can expand this yet further, we might care about trees, or biomes, or ecosystems, or the planet. And this was obviously put forward in deep ecology, or certain strands of deep ecology, and in the later thought of Arne Naess, one of the great founders of deep ecology, that if we can just extend value to all things, quite possibly through some kind of mystical experience or nature mystical encounter, then this is a good thing. This is an ecological self. There's only one problem with this from my point of view, which is that there's still an I, well, two problems. There's still an I at the center. If we choose the path of righteousness here, I got this image from a Google search of deep ecology, and it illustrates my point that there's still an I making the choice, and the boundaries are still solid. Here's another view of the self, which is actually another contemporary view of the self. I've called it the individuating self, but library cards are quite hard to edit after the event. I think I would now call it the multiple self. And this is the idea that the self still has this hard, rigid boundary, but there's not just an I, a singular I on the inside. There may be all sorts of selves in here. There might be repressed trauma. There might be neuroses, complexes. There might be archetypal forces working their way through me. And of course, the aim with a multiple self is to create a singular self, an individuated self, as Carl Jung would have put it. There's the great man, and rather than the picture of Freud, Freud's couch, which is rather beautiful. But I don't know if you've read Robin Carhart Harris and Carl Fristner's paper, The Rebus and the Anarchic Brain, which came out last month. Shame on you for not being up to speed. They're basically saying the same thing, that if you remove the big fat controller at the top of the brain, then these other parts of the self can come up. Repressed trauma can be dealt with, it can be integrated. So this is an idea of a multiple self that can be integrated into a singular self. I'm going to dwell now on another model of the self, and one that I'm arguing is a genuinely ecological self. And it comes from, not from a Western scholar, but from a Southern African Sangoma, Colin Campbell. I can tell you more about him later. He beautifully bridges the worlds of Southern African Indigenous Cosmovision and modernity. From the age of 6 to 21, he trained as a traditional African healer and is a bone reader. And he talks about the pervious self. This comes from Southern African Cosmovision. So here are the two differences. The first is there is no longer this hard shell around the self. The self is now permeable, like any membrane in the natural world. It is semi-permeable. But secondly, there's not just one thing in here. The self is an ecology. All sorts of things can dwell in here and should dwell in here. And in African cosmovision, that might be other members of the community, because there's no such thing as an individual in indigenous cultures. Everything is about community. Everything is about community. But it might also be the ancestors. It might be other than human spirits. It might be plant spirits. And the job is to maintain the health of this ecology. This is a radically different view of the self. Now, did you see what I did there? I'm doing this beautiful academic talk, and I've suddenly slipped in indigenous knowledge as though it were equivalent to Western knowledge. Shame on me. Let me restore Western epistemology as quickly as I can. This sounds remarkably similar to emerging thought within the humanities. I'm thinking particularly of the new materialism of Karen Barad, who's a quantum physicist turned feminist historian of science, and their idea that matter has agency. We are intimately entangled with the world, and the world is full of agency. Their book is called Meeting the Universe Halfway, and famously, it is so big, it does indeed meet the universe halfway. This idea of the pervious self is also has parallels with Bruno Latour and his actor network theory, the idea that we are all actors and agencies enmeshed in immense complex webs of agency. And if you like your humanities peppered with a bit of science, this paper came out in 2012, A Symbiotic View of Life. We have never been individuals. From an ecological, from a biological point of view, the idea that I am an individual, is nonsense. Half of you, unbeknownst to you, will have a species of mite living in the follicles of your eyelashes. And they're there quite happily, and you're quite happy with them being there. We all know about our gut biome, and there's incredible research being done to work out how the composition of our guts affects our mood and whether we suffer from illnesses like obesity. They use this term, the holobiont. I am an ecology. I am home for myriads of species. And they end their paper with this beautiful line, we are all lichens. Beautiful. To return to Southern Africa, the point is that perviousness, the perviousness of that boundary has to be maintained. So the point of doing ritual, of fasting, of drumming, of dancing, of singing, of going on vigil, of doing steam rituals, is to maintain the porosity of the self. Because they've worked out that if you don't, like a carapace, it gets back. What was it Terence McKenna said? Psychedelics dissolve the calcareous tumour of ego. It's the same thing, but it was right there in Indigenous cosmology. So, what I'm arguing is that if psychedelics make you pervious, they might maintain a genuinely ecological self. Does this answer James? Well, it does, because in African cosmovision, Southern African cosmovision, it doesn't matter at all what visions you have. It doesn't matter what you've done. It matters what you do for the community. It matters what you bring back. The measure of what you have achieved by your ritual austerities is by what you bring back to the community. They don't talk about what happens on vigil. Imagine that, going to an ayahuasca ceremony where there is no sharing circle. Radical idea, you've heard it here. And this is a very Jamesian idea. Pragmatism, measure things by what people do, not by what they say. And this, in fact, is what Robin and Carl do in their paper. They ask, what should we do with people's experiences, with their non-ordinary experiences? And they, like I've done, they bracket them and they say they are inarguably psychologically true. But as a scholar of religion, as I read on this paper, I was intrigued. There's a section in this paper called What to Do About the Woo. And they go on, they say, tenuous magical explanations can be challenged appropriately. Secular wisdom teaching, by which they mean non-religious Buddhism really, may ground psychedelic science and medicine whilst inoculating against evangelism. So as a scholar of religion, I'm intrigued. This incredible bit of high-level science, perfect science, suddenly tips into a work of theology, a normative theology, and suddenly they're telling us what can go on in our brains. in a paper called The Anarchic Brain. So it occurred to me that still it's the case that anarchic brains are good, but anarchic minds are bad. And that brings me to the second part of my talk, really, ontological anarchy. And I've got 5 minutes to do it. Thus far, I've been bracketing ontological truth claims of people's psychedelic experiences. What happens if I take those brackets off? After all, the fucking point of psychedelics is the experience, right? You can't just take all that away. Why do people do psychedelics? It's not because of what comes after, it's because of that, right? And if you bracket that, you are missing 90% of what's going on. I have another answer for Wiliam James, and it's slightly oblique, but bear with me. Do you all know the difference between the Holocene and the Anthropocene? The Holocene, right, climate science in 10 seconds. We should be heading towards a new ice age. We should be in an interglacial period, because that's what the Earth has been doing. We've had ice ages, warming up, ice age, warming up. But we've not been doing that. For the last 10,000 years or so, we've been in this incredible, stable state called the Holocene. We are all, thus far, Holocene people. We assume that the world is predictable, the climate is predictable. But some people have argued that we have now moved into the Anthropocene, where the influence of human activity on the world is so pervasive that it's written into the geological record. A paper came out in Nature a few years ago where they argued that the Anthropocene began in 1610. That's a very, very precise date. 1610. Why? If you look at the red line on the graph, that shows levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. If you want to know how they found that out, I can tell you later. And there was a dip in 1610. The lowest amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was in 1610 in the historical period. Why? I'll tell you why. Because in 1492, Christopher Columbus landed in the New World, and by 1610, so many indigenous people were dead that their fields had turned to forest, and the trees had sucked out the CO2 out of the atmosphere and cooled the planet. Our imperial exercise is written into climate history. And the estimates are that 50 million people had died by 1610. And that's before the Western Imperial Project really got going. All of this, and I don't just mean Greenwich Naval College or London, I mean the Academy, all this knowledge rests on the blood of 50 million indigenous people. We are in the Anthropocene. The times, I would say, demand that we challenge the ontology that created the Anthropocene. We do not know what is coming, and the predictions, and I've spoken to quite a few climate scientists, are dire. Extinction Rebellion are not making it up. We need to actively resist the mechanistic worldview that has got us into this mess, because I think ontological anarchy, ontological diversity might just get us through. Everyone knows from ecology that diversity produces resilience. How long have I got? 2 minutes. So, to put my money where my mouth is, let me hammer my ontological view onto the door of the Academy. You are under no obligation to believe me. This is how I see the world. The reason why we have ecodelic experiences is because whatever else psychedelics do, they work on the brain. And brains are made from the same stuff that produces peacock's feathers, that produces the intricate whirling wheel designs of coccolithophores that pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They're born of the same crystalline structure that produces quartz. We're all made from the same stuff. So why would it be anything else that we see the world as alive? That's how I see it. It's just a shame it's taken us so long to realise it. Thank you very much.